The Herter's catalog was a 2-inch thick, perfect bound book distributed to between 400,000 and 500,000 households across America every year. It sold duck decoys, fishing reels, reloading dyes, canoes, fiberglass boats, elk calls, trapping supplies, rifle stocks, waders, down sleeping bags, and its own brand of ammunition imported from Europe at prices that undercut every competitor in the market. A Fluger bait casting reel cost $5.47. A 15-foot wilderness canoe cost $165. A 3-horsepower outboard motor cost $69.97. Everything in the catalog was described as world famous or model perfect, or actually made far better than is necessary. Some of it was endorsed by the North Star Guide Association, the Hudson Bay Guide Association, or one of several other distinguished sounding organizations that did not exist and had been invented entirely by one man in Waseca, Minnesota. George Leonard Herter wrote every word of every catalog himself. He also wrote the instruction manuals, the promotional pamphlets, the books he sold through the same catalog, and the occasional newspaper column in which he explained how to survive a hydrogen bomb attack, prepare spinach in the manner favored by the Virgin Mary, or earn a substantial income by milking scorpions. He was described by Sports Afield magazine as a dazzling mixture of bamboozle and brains, snake oil and savvy. The New York Times called him a surly sage, gun-toting Minnesotan and all-American crank. He never allowed himself to be photographed. By the late 1960s, the business that eccentric man had built in a small Minnesota town was the largest mail-order outdoor sporting goods operation in the United States, and possibly the world. Cabela's, Bass Pro Shops, and Gander Mountain did not yet exist. Herter's was the template they would all eventually copy, and the business that would collapse before any of them arrived to benefit from what he had built. This is the full story of Herter's, from a dry goods store above a family garage in Waseca, Minnesota in 1937, to the catalog that became a cultural institution for 2 generations of American sportsmen, to the 700-page book that sat on coffee tables across the Midwest, the way the Sears Roebuck catalog had sat on coffee tables a generation earlier, to the Gun Control Act of 1968 that cut the business in half, to the overexpansion that finished it, to the bankruptcy in 1977, and to the Cabela's branded ammunition that still carries the Herter's name today on the shelves of the company that outlasted him by learning from everything he did. George Leonard Herter was born on May 24, 1911, in Waseca, Minnesota, the grandson of German immigrants. Waseca was, and remains, a small agricultural town in southern Minnesota, surrounded by the flat, fertile farmland of Waseca County, approximately 70 miles south of Minneapolis. It was not a place that produced famous men in great numbers, but it was surrounded by some of the best fishing and hunting country in the upper Midwest. Lakes and rivers filled with walleye, bass, pike, and panfish, farmland that harbored pheasant, duck marshes along the Minnesota River corridor, and forests to the north that held deer, bear, and grouse. The men who lived in and around Waseca were outdoorsmen by culture and necessity, and the supply of good gear at accessible prices was not a trivial matter in their lives. George Herter's father ran a dry goods store in Waseca, a general merchandise operation of the kind that supplied rural communities across the Midwest in the early 20th century with the household goods, clothing, and tools that the farm economy required. George grew up in the store, learning from childhood how retail worked, what customers needed, how to present products, and how to write about them in a way that made a buyer feel the purchase was not merely sensible, but urgent and wise. He earned the Purple Heart on European battlefields during the Second World War. He came back from that war, as many of his generation did, with a clearer sense of what mattered and a shorter patience for the things that did not. In 1937, George Herter took his father's dry goods store and began the transformation that would consume the next 4 decades of his life. From the second floor of the building, a space above the retail floor that became his first workspace, he began a mail-order fly tying supply business. Feathers, thread, hooks, and the tools and materials that fly fishermen needed to tie their own patterns were his first products. The customers he found in his first mail-order catalog were the same kind of men who lived around Waseca, outdoors men with limited budgets, practical instincts, and strong opinions about gear. In 1942, a gas explosion burned the original building to the ground. George Herter rebuilt. And when he rebuilt, he expanded the focus of the business from flight tying supplies to sporting goods in general. A decision that, in retrospect, seems obvious, but that at the time required the conviction that a mail-order business based in a small Minnesota town could serve the sporting goods needs of men across the entire country. There was no precedent for this in the outdoor industry at the scale Herter was imagining. Sears, Roebuck had proven the mail-order model in general merchandise. L.L. Bean had been selling outdoor boots by mail from Maine since 1912. But a comprehensive sporting goods catalog, one that could compete on price and selection with any local sporting goods store in the country and could be delivered to a farmhouse in South Dakota or a suburb in Ohio, had not yet been done. He was also operating during a period of extraordinary pent-up demand. The men who came back from the Second World War in 1945 and 1946 had money, time, and the particular appetite for outdoor activity that years of enforced indoor military life had created. They wanted to hunt, they wanted to fish, they wanted equipment that actually worked and that they could afford on a working-class income in a country that was, in the late 1940s, still finding its post-war footing. Herter's catalog met them exactly where they were: practical gear at honest prices, described with a voice that felt like it came from someone who had actually used the equipment in the field and had strong opinions about it. He was right that they wanted it. The catalog grew faster than he had initially planned. The post-war Herter's catalog grew quickly in both size and ambition. By the early 1950s, it ran to hundreds of pages and covered territory that no sporting goods retailer had previously attempted in a single publication. Duck decoys, made first from cork, then from balsa wood, then from plastic, were one of Herter's signature product lines, and the Waseca factory that manufactured them employed a significant portion of the town's workforce at its peak. But the decoys were only one small part of what the catalog offered. Fishing tackle of every kind: rods, reels, line, lures, hooks, sinkers, and the materials to make your own. Reloading equipment for rifle and shotgun cartridges, the dies, powder measures, case trimmers, and primers that allowed a serious shooter to reload his own ammunition at a fraction of the commercial cost. Camping gear, wading equipment, canoes, outboard motors, taxidermy supplies, and game calls of every variety, including the famous raccoon death cry call, which came packaged with an instructional 45 revolutions per minute record, an innovation that George Herter described as original and brilliant, which it was. Every item in the catalog was described by George Herter himself in language that occupied a territory somewhere between legitimate salesmanship and spectacular fiction. His rifle stocks were bird's-eye maple, shaped to his specifications by craftsmen of unmatched skill. His fiberglass canoe was the most advanced watercraft of its kind. His ammunition was formulated to higher standards than any commercially available round. He claimed his Wasp Waste sonic bullet actually increased in velocity after leaving a rifle barrel, a physical impossibility that he described with the calm authority of a man who had personally confirmed it. He also endorsed products through organizations that he had made up: the North Star Guide Association, the Hudson Bay Guide Association, various professional bodies whose names suggested authority and expertise, and whose membership consisted, in total, of George Leonard Herter. When customers wrote to these associations to inquire further, they received responses on official-looking letterhead. The letterhead came from the same building in Waseca where the catalog was printed. None of this damaged the business. The products, for all the extravagance of their descriptions, were typically good. Herter sourced aggressively from European manufacturers, particularly in Germany and France, where post-war industrial capacity exceeded domestic demand and high-quality manufactured goods could be acquired at prices that American manufacturers could not match. His rifle scopes, imported from Germany, were optically excellent. His primers and shot, imported from Mexico and Europe, filled a genuine market gap. The major American ammunition manufacturers were not selling reloading components to civilian consumers in the early 1950s, and Herter filled the gap with imported materials at prices that made hand-loading economically sensible for working-class shooters. His canoes and boats were serviceable and affordable in ways that the established boat manufacturers were not. The catalog reached 400,000 to 500,000 households per run by the late 1950s and early 1960s. Men across the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the Dakotas, Nebraska, waited for the Herter's catalog the way an earlier generation had waited for the Sears catalog. When it arrived, it went on the coffee table. Boys read it cover to cover. Adults ordered from it throughout the year. A trip to the Herter's retail store in Waseca, which George had opened alongside the catalog business in a facility that visitors compared to a museum of sporting goods, was an event. Taxidermied animals lined the walls. Every hunting and fishing item known to man was on display. There was a giant plastic moose on the front lawn. Making the trip to Waseca required planning. The store was not near any major city. Getting there meant a drive of an hour or more for most of the men who made it, and they arrived knowing they would spend most of the day. You walked in and you didn't walk out for hours. You went through the canoe section and the gun section and the decoy room and the fishing tackle aisles, and you came out with a list of things to order through the catalog and a head full of ideas about what you were going to do next season. The experience of the Herter store was something that men who were teenagers in the 1950s and 1960s described decades later with the specific, precise nostalgia. Not the vague nostalgia of a vanished era, but the detailed recall of an experience that had genuinely shaped how they thought about the outdoors. Doug Laudermeyer, a Twin Cities waterfowl historian who spent years documenting Herter's legacy, put it plainly: Cabelas wouldn't exist without Herter's. The model that Cabela's and Bass Pro Shops and Gander Mountain and Sportsman's Warehouse perfected. The massive destination store stocked with every conceivable outdoor product, anchored by impressive taxidermy displays, positioned as an experience as much as a retail transaction, had been invented by George Herter in Waseca, Minnesota, decades before any of them opened their first location. Leon Gorman, the grandson of L.L. Bean's founder and later chairman of the L.L. Bean Company, wrote of Herter's in his memoir about his family's business. He described the Herter's catalog as containing everything imaginable in fishing and hunting paraphernalia, camping equipment, and a wide variety of unrelated products, all described in the most grandiose and often humorous copy he had ever read. Gorman wished that he had saved his copies. The unrelated products were a distinctive Herter's feature. Alongside the duck calls and the reloading equipment and the rifle scopes, the Herter's catalog sold books. George Herter's self-authored books, which covered a range of subjects that reflected the particular territory of his mind. Bull Cook and Authentic Historical Recipes and Practices, which went through at least 15 editions between 1960 and 1970, and which the New York Times described as a wild mix of recipes, unsourced claims, and unhinged philosophy, became his most famous work. In it, he attributed specific recipes to historical figures with the same breezy authority with which he claimed his bullets exceeded the laws of physics. The Virgin Mary was very fond of spinach. This is as well a known fact in Nazareth today as it was 19 centuries ago. Ernest Hemingway cured his dandruff with 3 parts light rum to an ounce of port wine. He wrote Professional Guide's Manual, covering trophy preparation and the making of healthy mud soup. He wrote How to Get Out of the Rat Race and Live on $10 a Month. He wrote How to Live with a Bitch, a title that referred either to a hunting dog or to a woman, depending on which interpretation you preferred, and which Herter did not feel the need to clarify. He wrote The Truth About Hunting in Today's Africa, which contained the observation that most people don't realize: being eaten by a hyena doesn't hurt very much. These books were sold through the same catalog as the duck calls and the rifle dies. Their presence in the catalog was not a digression. It was essential to what Herter's had become. Not just a sporting goods supplier, but a personality, a voice, an idiosyncratic Minnesota, eccentric, who had somehow become the most trusted authority on outdoor equipment in the country, while simultaneously being one of the most unreliable narrators in the history of American retail. The business grew through the 1950s and into the 1960s at a pace that demanded more space, more inventory, and more staff. Herter's opened retail stores alongside the original Waseca facility, Glenwood, Minnesota, where a clay pigeon manufacturing plant was added, Mitchell, South Dakota, Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, Iowa City and Iowa Falls, Iowa, Olympia, Washington. A second major distribution facility was built in Mitchell to handle the expanding mail order volume. The Waseca headquarters grew into a complex of buildings that employed hundreds of workers at its peak. The duck decoy factory alone was a significant employer for a town of Waseca size. Then, in 1968, the federal government changed the rules. The Gun Control Act of 1968 passed in the aftermath of the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., prohibited the interstate mail-order sale of firearms and handgun ammunition. For most sporting goods businesses, this was a significant but manageable disruption. For Herters, whose identity and revenue were deeply tied to the mail-order sale of guns, reloading components, and shooting accessories, it was a structural wound. The catalog that had covered firearms comprehensively, pistols, rifles, shotguns, the components to reload your own cartridges, the stocks to customize your rifle, suddenly could not sell the products that many of his most loyal customers specifically came to it for. Herter fought back the only way he knew how, with the catalog. The post-1968 Herter's catalog was stripped of firearms content but expanded aggressively in every other direction. Clothing lines deepened, camping equipment expanded, the boat and canoe offerings grew. But men who had come to Herter that took ones specifically for guns and reloading equipment found that the post-1968 catalog was not quite the same document they had relied on, and some of them stopped coming back. Veterans who had built their relationship with the catalog around the reloading section found the new version hollow where it mattered most. The catalog that had been a complete outdoor resource had become, after 1968, an outdoor resource with a significant gap at its center. The second blow arrived from a different direction. Federal enforcement of the Endangered Species Act and related wildlife protection legislation in the early 1970s prohibited trade in the feathers of protected bird species whose feathers had been a core raw material in Herter's fly tying supply business since 1937. Herter had accumulated significant inventories of these feathers, legally purchased before the regulations took effect. The federal government's position was that existing inventories were subject to the new rules regardless of when they had been acquired. Lawsuits and federal seizures followed. For a business already wounded by the Gun Control Act, the federal enforcement was another direct hit to a major revenue category, and George Herter, who was constitutionally incapable of conceding that any authority external to himself might know better than he did about anything, fought the federal enforcement with the same combination of conviction and stubbornness that had written the claims about supersonic bullets. It cost him time, money, and attention that the business could not afford to spend. The third blow was self-inflicted. In the early 1970s, at the same moment that the business model was under regulatory pressure and the broader economic environment was being reshaped by the oil crisis and double-digit inflation, George Herter chose to expand his retail store network rather than consolidate. New stores required new leases, new inventory investments, new staff and management attention distributed across geographic distances that made oversight difficult. Double-digit interest rates made the financing of that expansion punishingly expensive at precisely the moment when the business's core revenue had been curtailed by regulation. The oil crisis of 1973 made the long drives to rural Herter stores less economical for customers who had previously been willing to make the pilgrimage to Waseca. Customers in Iowa or Wisconsin who had once driven 3 or 4 hours to spend the day in the Waseca store recalculated that trip against the cost of gasoline in 1974 and made a different decision. And into the gap came Kmart and Walmart, opening sporting goods departments in communities that had previously lacked local alternatives to mail order. The customer who had ordered from Herter's because there was no local option now had a local option. The prices were not as low as Herter's. The selection was not as comprehensive, but it was 10 minutes from home rather than 3 hours, and the gas was expensive and the economy was tight. Herter's went bankrupt in 1977. A Chicago sporting goods company purchased the assets and attempted to revive the operation. It went bankrupt within a few years. The Herter's name and remaining inventory eventually found their way to Cabela's, the mail-order outdoor sporting goods company that had been founded in 1961 in Sidney, Nebraska, by Dick Cabela, who had started selling fishing flies by mail from his kitchen table in a direct line of descent from the model George Herter had pioneered. Today, the Herter's name appears on Cabela's branded ammunition, steel case cartridges manufactured in Russia and Eastern Europe and sold at prices that honor the tradition of the Herter's value proposition, if not the man who created it. The Cabela's website sells Herter's decoys, Herter's waders, Herter's hunting clothing, the brand that George Herter built from a fly tying supply room above a dry goods store in Waseca, Minnesota, survives as a house brand for the company that outlasted him by learning the lesson he had spent 40 years demonstrating. One of the most coveted items at outdoor antique markets and sporting collectible shows is an original Herter's catalog from the 1960s. Collectors pay significant premiums for them. The duck calls are sought after. The wooden decoys in good condition command prices that would have astonished anyone who bought them new. Herter's fishing lure molds have been donated to the Harvey County Historical Society in Kansas. George Leonard Herter died on July 5, 1994, at the age of 83 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was buried at Fort Snelling National Cemetery, where his Purple Heart was the military record that survived him. The catalog that reached 500,000 American households does not exist in any digital archive. It never made it to the internet. It was a paper document from a paper era. And when the era ended, most copies ended with it. The men who remember reading it, the boys in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa, who sat on the floor of their father's living rooms and read every page of the Herter's catalog, who know exactly what a Fluger reel cost in 1967 and what the Wasp Waste sonic bullet was supposed to do, are in their 70s and 80s now. They still roll on the ground laughing at the claims. They still miss the store.